The story is one of the oldest in the Western imagination, and almost everyone knows its shape. A young goddess gathering flowers in a sunlit meadow wanders a little too far from her mother. The earth splits open. The Lord of the Dead rises up in his dark chariot, seizes her, and drags her down into the underworld to be his bride. Her mother, the goddess of the harvest, searches the earth in unbearable grief, and while she mourns, the world withers, the crops die, and winter comes for the first time. This is the myth of Persephone, and for most of its long history, it has been told as a story of abduction, a story about a girl who was taken. And that reading is not wrong. The oldest surviving version of the tale is unambiguous about the violence at its center. Persephone did not walk willingly into the dark. She was seized, carried off against her will, and her mother's world-freezing grief is the grief of a parent whose child has been stolen. To pretend otherwise, to erase the abduction, would be to falsify the story and to romanticize something that the myth itself treats as a wound. So we should begin by saying plainly what the story says. Persephone was taken. It is worth being careful here because a myth like this can be misread in either direction. To tell it only as a story of victimhood is to miss everything Persephone becomes. But to tell it only as a story of empowerment is to erase the real violence at its root and to romanticize an abduction. The truth the myth holds is harder and more interesting than either of those simplifications. It is the story of something terrible that was done to a young woman and of what she made of herself in its aftermath. Both halves are true at once, and the power of the myth lies precisely in refusing to let go of either one. But there is something strange about the way the myth ends, something that has troubled and fascinated readers for a very long time. Because Persephone does not simply escape and return to the meadow and become once again, the innocent girl she was. When the compromise is finally struck, when it is agreed that she will spend part of the year above and part below, the goddess who returns is not the same as the girl who left. She has eaten the food of the dead. She has become a queen, and for half of every year, of her own accord, she goes back down into the darkness to rule. It is a story we have never stopped needing, because it speaks to something we all must one day face. This is the detail the traditional telling struggles to explain. If Persephone was purely a victim, purely a girl longing for her mother and the light, then why does the myth leave her crowned as the queen of the underworld, a figure so powerful that heroes tremble before her, a sovereign of the dead in her own right? Why does she return again and again, season after season, to a realm that was supposed to be her prison? The story that begins as an abduction ends as something far more complicated, and in that complication lies a question the myth has been quietly asking for 3,000 years. The question is this: what if the descent that began as something done to her became in the end something she claimed? What if the girl who was taken chose somewhere in the darkness to stay? Not to excuse the violence that brought her there, but to refuse to remain only its victim. This is the reading that has drawn readers back to Persephone across the centuries, the possibility that her story is not only about what was taken from her, but about what she became once she was there. It is the story of how Kore, the maiden, became Persephone, the queen, and it begins with understanding that these were always two different people. Before she was Persephone, she was Kore. The name itself is worth pausing on, because in the Greek, it does not mean a personal name at all. Kore simply means the maiden or the girl. It is less a name than a description of a stage of life, a role. She was the daughter of Demeter, defined almost entirely by that relationship, the beloved child of the harvest goddess, gathering flowers in her mother's eternal spring. She had no realm, no throne, no domain of her own. She had youth and innocence and her mother's love, and she had the anonymity of being simply the girl, the maiden, Kora. This is easy to miss beneath the drama of the abduction, but it is essential. The Persephone who existed before the descent was, in a sense, not yet fully a person. She was a daughter, a role, an extension of her mother. Demeter's world was one of perpetual maidenhood, a garden of endless girlhood in which nothing changed, nothing died, and the daughter remained forever a child at her mother's side. It was safe, and it was beautiful, and it was a kind of stasis. Corey in the meadow had never had to become anything because she had never been anywhere but the garden. And then she was taken below, and something happened that the garden could never have produced. She was given a new name. In the underworld, she becomes Persephone, and she is no longer the maiden, the daughter, the girl. She is the queen of the dead, the dread sovereign whose name the ancients were sometimes afraid even to speak aloud. The transformation is written into the very names. Corey goes down, Persephone comes back, the maiden descends, and a queen returns. Whatever happened in the darkness, it turned a girl who was only ever a daughter into a woman who was a ruler in her own right. There is a reason so many cultures have a version of this figure, the daughter who must leave the mother's house to become herself. The bond between mother and daughter is one of the deepest in human experience, and it is also, for the daughter, one of the hardest to outgrow. To remain forever the beloved child, safe in the mother's world, is to never fully individuate, to never discover where the mother ends and the self begins. The myth dramatizes this as an abduction because that is how the necessary separation so often feels, like being torn away, like a violence. Even when it is the very thing that allows the daughter to become a woman in her own right rather than a girl in someone else's garden. This is why the myth resists being read as a simple tragedy of loss. On the surface, it is the story of a mother losing her daughter to death and darkness. But underneath, it is the story of a daughter gaining something her mother's garden could never have given her, a self that was not merely an extension of someone else, a realm that was hers alone, a name that was her own. The tragedy for Demeter, the loss of her child, is at the same time the making of Persephone, the birth of a queen. Two things are happening at once, and the culture that told the story tended to see only the first. Understanding this doubleness is the key to everything that follows. Persephone is not one figure, but two, held together in a single body, the maiden and the queen, the daughter of the light and the sovereign of the dark. Her myth is the story of the passage between them, the terrible and necessary journey by which the one becomes the other. And the question of whether she was taken or whether she chose is really the question of how we understand that passage, whether we see it as a girl destroyed or as a queen made. The answer, the myth suggests, is that it was somehow both. To understand what Persephone became, we have to descend with her into the story as it was told and into the darkness at its heart. The abduction itself is swift and violent. She is gathering flowers, in most versions reaching for a particularly beautiful bloom a narcissus set there as a lure, when the ground tears open beneath her. Hades, lord of the underworld, surges up in his chariot drawn by black horses, seizes her, and pulls her down before she can even cry out to be saved. The earth closes over her. In an instant, the world of light is gone, and the maiden is in the land of the dead. Above, her mother begins to search. Demeter's grief is one of the great portraits of maternal anguish in all of mythology. She wanders the earth without rest, without eating, without bathing, a torch in each hand, calling for her lost daughter. And as her grief deepens, the earth itself begins to die. The goddess of the harvest, consumed by mourning, withdraws her gift, and the crops fail, the fields turn barren, and famine spreads across the world. This is the myth's explanation for winter, but it is also something more. It is a picture of how the loss of the daughter freezes the entire world, how the severing of that bond has cosmic consequences. The gods cannot allow the world to die, and so a bargain must be struck. It is agreed that Persephone will be returned to her mother. But there is a catch. And the catch is the hinge on which the entire meaning of the myth turns. While she was in the underworld, Persephone ate something. She ate the seeds of a pomegranate, a few small red seeds, the food of the dead. And because she has eaten the food of the underworld, she cannot fully leave it. She is bound to it now. The compromise that emerges is that she will spend part of each year below, in the realm of the dead, and part above, with her mother in the light. When she is below, the world grieves and winter falls. When she returns, spring comes again. The number of seeds matters in the tellings, and the ancients counted them carefully. In most versions, she eats only a few, and each seed becomes a month she must spend below. The smallness of the act against the enormity of its consequence is part of its power. A handful of seeds determines the turning of the entire year, the death and rebirth of the whole living world. It is as though the myth is insisting that the smallest choices made in the darkness, the things we take into ourselves when no one is watching, are precisely the ones that bind us most completely and shape the rest of our lives. What she swallowed in the underworld could never be undone, and neither the myth suggests can what any of us take in during our own passages through the dark. The pomegranate is the strangest and most debated detail in the whole story, and it is where the question of choice becomes unavoidable. In some tellings, she is tricked into eating the seeds or forced, but in others, she eats them knowingly, and this small act changes everything. To eat the food of the dead is to belong to the realm of the dead. It is the act that binds her to the underworld forever, that makes her return there not merely a punishment, but a necessity written into her very being. Whether she was tricked or whether she chose, the pomegranate is the moment the maiden becomes permanently tied to the dark, the moment there is no longer any going fully back. And here is what the traditional reading tends to pass over. After the bargain, Persephone could have been portrayed as a prisoner counting the days until her release, a captive who endures her time below and lives only for her return to the light. But that is not how the myth leaves her. It leaves her as a queen. When she is in the underworld, she is not weeping in a corner. She is on a throne. She rules. She judges. She holds power over the dead and over the living, who dare to descend. Whatever the pomegranate was, trick or choice, its result is not a prisoner, but a sovereign. And a sovereign is a very strange thing for a victim to become. Watch what Persephone becomes in the underworld, and the story shifts beneath your feet. In the myths where she appears as queen, she is not a frightened girl longing for the surface. She is a figure of genuine and formidable power, one of the most feared deities in the Greek imagination. When heroes descend into the underworld, it is often Persephone they must appeal to, Persephone whose favor they must win, Persephone who holds the power to grant or deny. She is the one who can release a soul or refuse it. She rules beside Hades, and in many stories, she is the more active sovereign of the two, the one who makes the decisions that shape the fate of the dead. There is a particular story that captures this transformation perfectly. When the great musician Orpheus descends into the underworld to beg for the return of his dead wife, it is Persephone who is moved by his song, Persephone who grants his wish, Persephone whose mercy sets the terms of his impossible bargain. The girl who was once too powerless to cry out against her own abduction has become the queen who decides whether the dead may return to life. The one who was taken now holds the power of taking and giving back. This is not the arc of a victim. It is the arc of someone who has come into a power she never had in the garden. And this is what makes the reading of choice so compelling, not as a denial of the abduction, but as a description of what she did with where it left her. Persephone could have remained forever only the girl who was stolen, defined eternally by the worst thing that ever happened to her. Instead, in the darkness, she became something else. She took the realm that was meant to be her prison and made it her domain. She took the name that was forced upon her and wore it as a crown. She did not choose to be taken, but somewhere in the underworld, she chose to reign. And that choice, the choice to rule rather than merely to suffer, is the real transformation at the heart of the myth. It is telling that the ancients feared Persephone in a way they never feared the maiden core. Her name was spoken with caution. She was invoked in oaths and curses, appealed to in the rites of the dead, imagined as a presence of genuine dread. No one trembles before a girl picking flowers. They trembled before the queen. And that fear is itself a kind of testimony and admission encoded in the culture's own reverence that the figure who came back from the underworld was not diminished by her descent, but magnified by it. The world does not fear what has been broken. It feared Persephone because it understood, however dimly, that she had gone into the dark and returned holding power. The pomegranate, read through this lens, becomes something remarkable. It becomes the moment she binds herself to her own power. To eat the seeds is to accept that she now belongs to the underworld, and belonging to it means for her ruling it. The seeds tie her to the one place where she is not Kore the maiden, but Persephone the queen, the one place that is hers and not her mother's. Seen this way, eating the pomegranate is not a trap she falls into, but a claim she makes, a refusal to be only a visitor in her own life, a decision to keep a foothold in the realm where she is sovereign. She ensures, with those few red seeds, that she can never be fully returned to the garden, never fully reduced again to the girl she was. This does not erase the darkness of how she arrived. It is precisely because her arrival was not chosen that her sovereignty is so striking. She was thrown into the underworld, and rather than spend eternity as its prisoner, she became its queen. This is not a story that excuses what was done to her. It is a story about what a person can become in the aftermath of what was done to them, about the difference between being defined by a wound and being transformed by how you answer it. Persephone answered by taking a throne, and the myth, whatever its tellers intended, cannot quite hide the fact that the girl who went down as a captive comes back up as a ruler. There is a reason this myth has never stopped speaking to people, and it is not really about gods or the literal land of the dead. The descent into the underworld is one of the oldest and most universal symbols human beings have ever produced, and it stands for something everyone eventually encounters. It stands for the journey into darkness that no one chooses but no one entirely escapes, the passage through grief, loss, suffering, and the hidden depths of the self. The descent that seems like the end of everything and turns out sometimes to be the beginning of who you really are. Depth psychology has long recognized this pattern, the descent, as the necessary path to transformation. There are things a person cannot become while remaining safe in the sunlit garden of their untested life. There is a kind of maturity, a depth, a sovereignty over oneself that can only be earned in the dark through the encounter with everything the garden was designed to keep out. Loss and fear and death in the unknown parts of one's own nature. The person who has never descended remains, in a sense, Kore, the eternal maiden, innocent and incomplete, defined by others, safe and unformed. It is the descent that makes the queen. This is why Persephone's story resonates far beyond its mythological details. Everyone, at some point, is taken from the garden. Everyone is pulled against their will into some underworld of grief or crisis or profound change, some darkness they did not choose and would never have chosen. The abduction is universal. What is not universal is what happens next. Some people spend the rest of their lives as captives of their underworld, defined forever by the descent, longing only to return to a garden that no longer exists and to a self that can no longer be recovered. And some people, in the dark, find a throne. This is why the story has been retold in 1,000 forms, in every tradition that speaks of a hero or a soul that must journey into the underworld and return. The descent and the return is one of the fundamental shapes of the human story because it maps something everyone lives. We are all sooner or later taken from the garden. We lose what we loved, we face what we feared, we are pulled into depths we did not choose. And the question the myth poses to each of us is the same question it poses to Persephone. Not whether we will descend, for that is not ours to decide, but who we will be when we come back up, and whether we will let the darkness destroy us or crown us. The myth suggests something profound about this passage, which is that you cannot go back. This is what the pomegranate really means. Once you have descended, once you have eaten the food of the underworld, once you have truly known loss or grief or the depths of yourself, you cannot return to being the person you were before. The seeds bind you. The garden is no longer fully available. The maiden who never suffered is gone, and she is not coming back. This can be read as a tragedy, the loss of innocence. But the myth offers another reading. What you lose in innocence, you may gain in sovereignty. You cannot be Chorus again, but you can be Persephone. And this is perhaps the deepest wisdom the myth holds, that the descent, however it begins, contains the possibility of transformation rather than only destruction. The darkness that takes the maiden is the same darkness that crowns the queen. The realm that looks like a prison is the realm where she finds her power. This does not make the descent gentle or fair or chosen. It makes it meaningful. It suggests that even the darkness we are dragged into against our will can become, if we let it, the ground on which we build a self that the garden could never have given us. The descent is not only where things are lost, it is also sometimes where the queen is made. What makes Persephone one of the most enduring figures in all of mythology is that she does not, in the end, choose between her two selves. She does not abandon the underworld to return permanently to her mother's garden, nor does she abandon the light to remain forever below. She becomes, uniquely, the goddess of both, the one figure who moves between the world of the living and the world of the dead, who belongs fully to neither, and rules across the boundary between them. She is the maiden and the queen, spring and death, the girl in the meadow and the sovereign on the throne, and she is all of these at once. This dual sovereignty is what sets her apart, and it is why she has been read again and again as an image of the fullness of the feminine, of a womanhood that refuses to be only one thing. The culture that made her tended to divide women sharply into the innocent maiden or the dangerous power, the pure daughter or the fearsome queen, the girl to be protected or the woman to be feared. Persephone collapses that division. She is both without contradiction. She carries her springtime innocence and her underworld authority in the same person, and neither cancels the other. She is proof that a woman does not have to choose between being gentle and being powerful, between the light and the depth. There is something quietly revolutionary in this, especially against the background of the other stories the culture told. So many myths insist that a woman's power must come at the cost of her softness, that to gain authority she must become monstrous, that the queen and the maiden cannot coexist. Persephone holds them together. She returns each spring, and the flowers bloom, and she descends each autumn and takes her throne among the dead, and she is fully herself in both. Her power does not make her a monster. Her innocence does not make her powerless. She is the rare mythological figure who is allowed to be complete. It is striking, too, that Persephone never severs the bond with her mother in order to claim her throne. She does not have to destroy Demeter to become a queen, nor abandon her queenship to remain a daughter. She keeps both. Each year she returns to the garden and is again her mother's beloved child, and each year she descends and is again the sovereign of the dead. The myth refuses the false choice that so many stories force upon women, the choice between love and power, between the bond and the self. Persephone holds the bond and the crown together, and in doing so, she models something rare, a wholeness that does not require the amputation of any part of who she is. And her movement between the worlds is not a punishment she endures, but a rhythm she embodies. The ancient world came to associate her not only with death, but with the renewal that follows it, with the seed that must go into the dark earth before it can rise as grain, with the cycle by which life passes through death and returns. Persephone is the one who makes that passage and survives it over and over, the goddess who proves that the descent is not final, that what goes down can come back transformed. She is death and she is spring, and the fact that she is both is the whole point. The Queen of the Dead is also the bringer of new life. This is why the reading of her story as chosen matters so much, and why it is more than a modern imposition on an old tale. To read Persephone as purely a victim is to freeze her forever in the moment of her abduction, to define her by the worst thing done to her, to see only the girl taken and never the queen made. To read her as having, in some sense, claimed her descent is to grant her the completeness the myth itself grants her, to see her as a figure of agency and power rather than only of loss. The myth leaves her crowned. The least we can do is see the crown. 7, why she chose the underworld, so we can return finally to the question the title poses and answer it with everything the myth has shown us. Why would Persephone choose the underworld? Why would she eat the seeds that bound her to the dark? And why would she return season after season to a realm that began as her prison? The answer is hidden in the difference between the two worlds and the two selves that belong to them. Above, in her mother's endless garden, she could only ever be Cora, the maiden, the daughter, the girl. Below, she was Persephone, the queen. She chose the underworld because the underworld was the only place she was sovereign. Consider what the garden actually offered her. Safety, yes, and love, and eternal spring. But also eternal childhood, a life lived entirely as an extension of her mother, a self that would never be tested, never deepened, never fully her own. In the garden, she would remain forever, the girl picking flowers, beloved and protected, and incomplete, a daughter and nothing more. The garden was a beautiful cage, and its bars were made of safety and love, which are the hardest bars of all to see. To stay there forever would have been to never become anyone at all. The underworld took everything the garden offered and inverted it. It was dark where the garden was bright, fearful where the garden was safe, a realm of death where the garden was a realm of endless life. But it gave her the one thing the garden never could. It gave her a self. In the underworld, she was not her mother's daughter, but her own sovereign. She had a realm, a throne, a name, a power that answered to no one. She was feared and obeyed. She decided the fate of the dead and the living who came seeking her mercy. The place that looked like the end of her was the making of her, and some part of her knew it, and that is why she ate the seeds. There is a final truth folded into the pomegranate, and it is the hardest and the most freeing of all. The seeds meant she could never go fully back, and the myth does not treat this only as a loss. It treats it as the price and the proof of having become someone. To be unable to return to the garden is to have grown beyond it. The people who can still fit into the small, safe self they once were are usually the people who have never truly descended. Persephone could not fit back into Kor, and that impossibility was not her tragedy. It was the evidence of her transformation, the sign that the girl had genuinely become the queen, and that there was no undoing it. This is the deep meaning the myth has held for so long, whispered underneath the surface story of abduction and grief. It is the recognition that sometimes the descent we would never have chosen becomes the making of us, that the darkness we are dragged into can become the ground of a power we could never have found in the light, that there are selves that can only be born in the underworld. Persephone did not choose to be taken, but she chose what to become once she was there. She chose the throne over the corner, the crown over the chains, sovereignty over mere survival. And in choosing to rule the darkness rather than merely endure it, she became something the garden could never have made. And so she returns every autumn of her own accord down into the dark. The world reads it as her season of exile, the time when the earth grieves and the cold comes. But there is another way to see that descent. It is the queen going home to her kingdom. It is the woman returning to the one place where she is fully herself, fully powerful, fully sovereign. She carries the light of the garden with her, and she carries the crown of the underworld back up into the spring, and she belongs completely to both. The girl who was taken became the woman who chose, and what she chose was not the darkness for its own sake, but the self she could only become within it. She chose the underworld because that was where she became a queen. And a queen once made does not give up her throne.